Good morning, this is Listen to VOA, Japanese English listening material site. Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese Empire occupied the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. During World War II, from March 1942 until after the end of the war in September 1945, the Dutch East Indies had been a colony of the Netherlands since 1819. However, the Netherlands itself had been occupied by Germany in 1940 and thus had little ability to defend its colony against the Imperial Japanese Army. And less than 3 months after the first attacks on Borneo, the Japanese Navy and Army overran Dutch and Allied forces. Most Indonesians welcomed the Japanese as liberators from their Dutch colonial masters in 1944-1945. Allied troops largely bypassed Indonesia and did not fight their way into the most populous parts such as Java and Sumatra. As such, most of Indonesia was still under occupation at the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945. The occupation was the first serious challenge to the Dutch in Indonesia and ended Dutch colonial rule. By its end, changes were so numerous and extraordinary that the subsequent Indonesian national revolution became possible. Unlike the Dutch, the Japanese facilitated the politicization of Indonesians down to the village level. The Japanese educated, trained and armed many young Indonesians and gave their nationalist leaders a political voice. Thus, through both the destruction of the Dutch colonial regime and the facilitation of Indonesian nationalism, the Japanese occupation created the conditions for the proclamation of Indonesian independence within days of the Japanese surrender in the Pacific. However, the Netherlands sought to reclaim the Indies, and a bitter 5-year diplomatic, military and social struggle ensued, resulting in the Netherlands recognizing Indonesian sovereignty in December 1949. Until 1942, Indonesia was colonized by the Netherlands and was known as the Dutch East Indies. In 1929, during the Indonesian National Awakening, Indonesian nationalist leaders Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, later founding president and vice president, foresaw a Pacific War and that a Japanese advance on Indonesia might be advantageous for the independence cause. The Japanese spread the word that they were the light of Asia. Japan was the only Asian nation that had successfully transformed itself into a modern technological society at the end of the 19th century, and it remained independent when most Asian countries had been under European or American power, and had beaten the European power, Russia, in war. Following its military campaign in China, Japan turned its attention to Southeast Asia, advocating to other Asians a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which they described as a type of trade zone under Japanese leadership. The Japanese had gradually spread their influence through Asia in the first half of the 20th century, and during the 1920s and 1930s had established business links in the Indies. These ranged from small-town barbers, photographic studios and salesmen, to large department stores and firms such as Suzuki and Mitsubishi becoming involved in the sugar trade. The Japanese population peaked in 1931 with 6,949 residents before starting a gradual decrease, largely due to economic tensions between Japan and the Netherlands Indies government. Such encouragement of Indonesian nationalism was part of a broader Japanese plan for an Asia for the Asians. While most Indonesians were hopeful for the Japanese promise of an end to the Dutch racially based system, Chinese Indonesians, who enjoyed a privileged position under Dutch rule, were less optimistic. Also concerned were members of the Indonesian communist underground who followed the Soviet Union's Popular United Front against fascism. Japanese aggression in Manchuria and China in the late 1930s caused anxiety amongst the Chinese in Indonesia, who set up funds to support the anti-Japanese effort. Within only 4 months, the Japanese had occupied the archipelago. Before the arrival of Japanese troops, there were conflicts between rival Indonesian groups where people were killed, vanished or went into hiding. Chinese and Dutch-owned properties were ransacked and destroyed. 14. The invasion in early 1942 was swift and complete. On the 27th of February, the Allied Navy's last effort to contain Japan was swept aside by their defeat in the Battle of the Java Sea. 17. From the 28th of February to the 1st of March 1942, Japanese troops landed on 4 places along the northern coast of Java almost undisturbed. 18. The fiercest fighting had been in invasion points in Ambon, Timor, Kalimantan, and on the Java Sea. In places where there were no Dutch troops, such as Bali, there was no fighting. On the 9th of March, the Dutch commander surrendered along. That's all. Thank you. Listen to VOA.